It's so absurd. It has no legal basis in the NATO treaty or even in the law. So NATO just keeps huffing and puffing. This was a public relations exercise designed to stick it to China.
If this actually does happen, and it's almost certainly not going to, it will have an immediately deleterious effect on their economy. It will create uncertainty in the market, it will have a negative impact on jobs, income, employment opportunities. So I think the UK will most definitely be very, very concerned about the economic impact, as will other European nations.
If you ask me about immediate solution, I'd probably say just, make a very clear headcount in the inventory of our assets and investment portfolio in any given region of the whole world to find out what's the situation and what's going on, and try to use the legal weapons to protect our assets. But that's not the fundamental solution towards our long-term issues.
The Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to The Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyen. Joining me to discuss possible NATO moves to reclaim Chinese-owned infrastructure in Europe are Harvey Dzodin, a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Dr. Chu Qiang, fellow of the Belt and Road Research Center, Minzu University of China, and Mike Baston, a China observer and a senior lecturer at the University of Southampton in the UK. It's a great pleasure to have you all back on the chat. So NATO officials are reportedly deliberating actions to reclaim some Chinese-owned infrastructure projects in Europe if, as they claim, a wider conflict with Russia arises. So let me start with Harvey. What's your first response to the news?
Oh, it's bizarre. It's really bluster. It's BS. It reminds me, actually, of the famous quote from Shakespeare's Macbeth. A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, because it's so absurd. It has no legal basis in the NATO treaty or even in the law. So NATO just keeps huffing and puffing, but there's no there. And so just as the U.S. government and its puppet allies falsely claim without one shred of proof that Chinese companies like Huawei employ hidden backdoors to give their government access to confidential information, there's no proof here either. That's why the hostile governments only say that there's a theoretical possibility. This is not an actual fact in the NATO case or in the Huawei case. And it's the same as saying, if I'd been born with wings, I'd be an airplane. It's the same for NATO. It's led by the U.S. They claim that China provides dual-use equipment that's being used in Russia by Russia in the war against Ukraine. But they offer no evidence. In any case, the threat's there just to saber rattle against China because it may only be implemented if the war spills beyond Ukraine's border to the territory of a NATO member.
You're saying there's no legal basis, but they can create such a basis, right? They submit some motion and pass it whenever they want.
Of course, they can create a fig leaf, but it's merely a fig leaf, and it may not well be recognized in international law. So there aren't any legal grounds, especially now since Ukraine is not a NATO member. And so something that might be applicable, or certainly would be if it were, is Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And that's the one that says an attack against one NATO member is an attack against all NATO members. And that may come the closest under the law to being actionable. So that's why they're hedging and to implement this policy as a prospective action that they're considering if they find that the war spills over to a NATO member state. So to me, I think that the only principle or two that might apply here, one of them is George W. Bush In Latin, they say mia via aut via publica.
What does it mean?
That in English is my way or the highway.
Right.
Or its corollary, aius est quod factum est. Might makes right. Anyhow, NATO is not a sovereign power, but only a defense pact. International law would have to be stretched really to the breaking point if the threat is turned into action. And frankly, I don't think it's ever going to get there.
But Harvey, obviously you graduated from Harvard Law and used to be a legal advisor to U.S. President Jimmy Carter. You've got authority there when it comes to legal affairs, but isn't that what they did to Russia and how they did that?
Well, of course, nations like powerful people could play games. But I suspect that in NATO, they're not going to get any unanimity here.
Right.
With certain countries, for example, Hungary maybe being the most on point, they're not going to get sign off from a country like Hungary to go along with this. So I don't think it's going to come to pass. And I think there's many other problems with doing this. There are problems that if NATO does this, led by the United States, these are going to come back to bite the U.S. and others in a number of ways. It's not as if China is the sick man of Asia that it once was. It's a powerful country. And Russia is a powerful country. And I don't believe, actually, that this is going to happen. I think it's a step too far. Right. I'm not saying it wouldn't happen 100%, but I'm saying that there are a lot of complications here which make it unlikely, and that I'm not sure it's ever going to get beyond the talking, huffing and puffing stage.
All right. Then to Mike, you're from one of the NATO member countries. So What's your first response?
Well, I think, as Harvey points out, it's predicated on the possibility of this conflict escalating beyond the borders of Ukraine. If that happened, that automatically puts it into NATO territory. And as Harvey quite rightly put out, NATO members are committed to defending each other. So here we go with, you could say, World War III. So is that likely to happen? I think highly unlikely. It's not in Russia's interest. It's not in anyone's interest at all. So that's the starting point. It's highly unlikely in the first place. Secondly, I think it's a whispering campaign. I don't think this is an official NATO pledge agreement. It's not coming from the leadership or leadership teams of the countries that make up NATO. It's certainly not coming from the new Labour administration, which I think is very positive when it comes to engagement and broader engagement beyond NATO. Early signs are very, very encouraging. It seems to be a whispering campaign from one or two NATO officials, probably led by the US, to arouse some debate. And I think it's got more to do with the US posturing and the sort of decline of their political power in the Asia-Pacific region. China has made it repeatedly clear it doesn't support the conflict or support Russia in any way. It remains open. It's not supplying them with lethal weapons. When it comes to legal authority, though, it's another question you raised. I suspect nation states probably can resort to emergency measures, and there is a precedent here where I think the Finnish government actually blockaded the Helsinki shipyard for about a year. I think ice-breaking ships run by a Russian company as a result of the conflict, and the company actually did sell to a Canadian company. So I think emergency measures instigated by individual nation states could happen. But again, it's a very remote possibility, and I suspect the US will probably pursue bilateral approaches because NATO will not take this any further.
When you say some individual states, which countries do you mean?
Well, Hungary is the obvious one. We've seen very, very good relations.
All right.
And possibly other Eastern European countries, possibly where the Americans feel they can get some sort of support for an increased threat. But I think it really is something and nothing. I don't see the conflict. Sadly, I don't see the conflict being resolved in the short term, but I don't see it going or being allowed to go beyond the borders of Ukraine, in which case this doesn't really apply. And I think we have to come back to the fact that since 2013, we're looking at tens of billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure across Europe, rail lines from China to Eastern Europe, ports in Greece, in Italy, and countries have benefited this. Without infrastructure development, economies don't work. This is the sort of the building block. This is the sort of ground floor. There's tremendous benefits in terms of trade across the region, across the Asia-Pacific and European economic region, where countries have benefited from the Belt and Road Initiative, and long may that continue.
Right, but they reclaim it. It's not like they're destroying them. Right? If they, have the ownership of those infrastructure projects, maybe they can get more profits from there.
Well, possibly, but I don't see it. That's a very dangerous precedent if that happens. Nation states, quite rightly, probably do have the powers within their governments, their political sort of leaders to enact such legislation. But in so doing, you really do create a real wall against foreign direct investment, against engagement with other countries and companies from other countries, which is really what the global economy needs now: multilateral trade, bringing down trade barriers and borders. So it really is a very, very draconian step, which creates a very dangerous precedent. So again, I would see what the Finnish government did, I think, was quite small scale, focused, localized, and it borders Russia. So I don't see this really going much further. I think it will peter out. So, yeah.
All right, and we'll dive deeper into the details of such impact later on. But Dr. Chu, you've been listening to those two guest speakers. What was your first response? And Harvey and Mike are both saying that it's highly unlikely that this could happen. What's your take?
Well, I think they both have a point. I think NATO is very greedy, but they're not stupid. And I think NATO is not a organization with one boss yelling in order and everybody will rush into the same direction. Not even for this kind of a small decision, even in a big issue. Just take a look at the Ukraine crisis. Even though everybody agreed they will, fight against Russia for Ukraine, but just take a look. Any member country really have devoted their troops and the real deal military forces into this battlefield, even though this decision goes unanimously without saying. But besides everybody, just to give them some artilleries, shellings, and, some probably funding, and no country actually put into some real deal support into Ukraine, for example, ground forces, for example, more of the technology transfer or capacity, for example, allowing Ukraine to build kinds of the artilleries inside their own border. No, just to give them some inventory of the old bombs and bullets and etc. Something only like that. So, the Ukraine crisis is probably the biggest issue faced by NATO together. Right. And they do not agree with each other. Well, even though they agree with each other on the same page on the facade, but in actual practice, they didn't do the same thing together. When it comes to China, it's going to be much, much, much more complicated than that. Because China is not an enemy, not even an enemy of America. In the toughest statement in America, they only describe China as a competitor, as decisive enabler, but not as strong as Russia, as Iran, or other countries. So even within their own narrative, China is not the enemy. That's the number one thing. Number two thing, in many of the NATO, probably all of the NATO countries in their government and guidelines, China is one of their partners, trading partners, investment partners, technology partners. And we both have very huge stake in each other. For example, Germany alone have invested in China in the past 15 years about more than 150 billion euro. And I guess similar size with France and many other to come, like Finland, Sweden, Spain, you name it. And China, we have probably accumulatively in the past 15 years, we invested in the European Union about 300 billion US dollars. Well, this is just the investment. When investment turns into or be translated into assets, the evaluation probably is be higher. So the stake is very, very high at each other. And well, just assume most extreme situation. If NATO really decided to, reclaim Chinese assets in the European Union, and China will retaliate the same towards the NATO countries. So which means, you plus one, I plus one, or you take me one, I take you one, equals to nothing. Okay, so it hurt both of each other. This kind of a situation. So it's meaningless to do so, right? It's like school kids fighting each other, something like that. And also from the legal basis, I mean, NATO is not a administrative organization, and there's no legal base that they can have to reclaim another country's assets. And even if they do so, and they need to vote around the 32 member countries. And I don't think this is very easy to do so. Just take a look at Sweden. When Sweden wants to join in the NATO, just one country can block their decision. That is Hungary, right? And Sweden just to get into the NATO. And I think this is the defense minister of Sweden. The first meeting in the NATO, I think, is pretty much no for him. Well, I hope it's best for him. But see, the whole process, legal process, can be blocked by even one member country. So when Germany is the largest trading partner with China, when they say no, and they have a huge stake in China as well, when they say no, NATO cannot make a move. When Hungary say no, they cannot make a move because Hungary is the all-weather comprehensive partner with China. And there are many countries like France. So France, shake hands with China very frequently in the past, few years. So, well, this probably is just to put on the stance, showing China a stance of NATO. And, it's a bluffing move. I don't think it's really going to work.
Well, you all mentioned the role Hungary can play in this regard, but can other NATO members actually circumvent Hungary or any other member opposing the plan? I think it's EU, right? They're talking about suspending Hungary as a voting right. Can't they do that?
No, I'm not quite a legal expert of NATO's voting or so-called democratic, process, because they are not a government. They're not an international, multilateral by organization, typical ones like UN or, WTO. So I assume they probably have some legal process to do so. But considering the case of Sweden, I assume the member countries still have a very large say in important meetings. Well, when NATO decided to protect the Ukraine, Hungary voted yes. So I think when the NATO they decided to fight against Russia, I think Hungary just waved up their vote, waved up the rights. They only say we don't go there, but you can decide for yourself. So I think that's the situation how it is. So I can assume that the member state in the NATO can actually play a very important role. So it's not very easy, for the current mechanism and framework of operation for the NATO to fight against another major country, since they have already been confronting Russia on the front line. So it's not very wise to drag another major economy and a military force power in the whole world into, their confrontation.
Right. Harvey, I'm not sure if you can explain whether, NATO can theoretically block Hungary's, voting or votes there.
I don't think they can. And we're only talking about Hungary here, right. But there are other actors that also will want to weigh in. So besides Hungary, another country that comes to mind is Turkey, or Turkiye as it's called now,
right.
Because Turkiye and President Erdogan generally take quite a centrist position on this. They're maintaining their ties with the Russian Federation and President Putin at the same time that they're maintaining their ties with the U.S., Ukraine, EU, and so on. So this is a very complicated matter. I know, for example, in the EU, it's not possible for the EU to throw any member out. So Hungary is actually the president in the EU of what's called the European Council, the head of all the different countries. And it's impossible to remove a country from EU without the permission of the country that's being removed. And I think in NATO, whether that's the fact in law or in practice, that it would bust apart the alliance if they silenced, removed, or straitjacketed any of its members. So NATO operates a lot on the principle of consensus. And to do something like you're suggesting, I think would be the way to rip NATO apart. So I do not think it's going to happen, as I do not think that this particular action is going to happen either. I think it's a show. It's a theater. It's not something that's actively being contemplated. It's even less real than what NATO wanted to do, and that is open up an office in Tokyo to show that NATO was going to have a presence in the what's called Indo-Pacific region. That didn't happen, and I'm not sure it's going to happen. It certainly shouldn't happen because we're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is not the Northeast Asia Treaty Organization or anything like that. So I think it's kind of a measurement of the times that we live in which there's this confrontation being pushed by the U.S. and its allies to stick it to China, because those allies, especially the United States, who's leading them, they're mad that they're not keeping pace with China. I think it's wrong when we should be working together to end this conflict, not to be pointing fingers where there's no proof.
This has been the Chat Lounge. When we come back, we'll have more on how China may react if NATO makes the move.
Dive into news like never before with Deep Dive, the podcast from CGTN Radio. Join our global reporters for captivating stories and thought-provoking conversations. Search Deep Dive on your favorite podcast platforms and get ready to dive in.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We're discussing possible NATO moves to reclaim Chinese-owned infrastructure projects in Europe. It's good to hear that the likelihood is quite low, but if NATO makes the move, what could be the possible immediate impacts and reactions by China? Chinese people always, we are taught actually to prepare for the worst in a lot of circumstances. We've seen Joe Biden, the head of the leading country of NATO, already said China has to understand that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of what they call supporting Russia. Dr. Chi, you've been researching the Belt and Road Initiative. What European infrastructure projects has China invested in, and especially those related to the BRI, and which are most likely to be nationalized by NATO if that really happens? I think Mike already mentioned some, but can you give us a little bit more numbers or specific projects there?
Well, I think in China, I have done many of the infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative and the European Union in the past 10 years. Many are very famous, for example, our China-Serbia and Hungary highway, as well as BRA's port in Greece. So many of them actually have been implemented and been used. So as well as the China and the European Express Railway through the Chinese inland cities, for example, like Chongqing, through the Middle Asia, and then goes to Germany, goes to Rotterdam in Dutch. So these are all very important infrastructures through the Belt and Road Initiative, and in creating huge economic and social benefit for the European Union as well as for China. For example, when the COVID outbreak, and this railway has played a very important role because many of the ports, many of the sea transportations during the COVID has been hampered because a lot of the seamen needs to be checked for their pandemic situation. And meanwhile, last year to this year, we've been seeing the Red Sea crisis. The Houthi arms military forces has been blocking the Red Sea, and so probably for the transport, the cargo shipment for goes through the Malacca Strait to the Red Sea. Now have to take a detour through the Cape of Good Hope, and that will be another extra 2 weeks of tour and more than thousands of US dollars extra cost on each containers. So that shows that this high-speed railway through China to European Union actually protected the basic supply chain and guaranteed the most important product can be still transported on land, and it's very important, guarantee or plan B for their national trade and globalization. And also more of this project is going to be done since China right now has been done with China-Kazakhstan Railway and then goes to the Caspian Sea and later shipped it to the Mediterranean and go to Greece and then shipped into Europe. As well as we have China-Tajikistan, Uzbekistan Railway also connected to the Caspian Sea and then goes to the Mediterranean and goes to Greece or Italy or other European Union countries. So these are important infrastructures. I don't think that really, are independently or only owned by China. It's actually, they're all joint venture owned by both China and the partner country in the European Union. So sometimes it's like slapping your competitors, but also slapping on your own face, that kind of situation. If they're going to really reclaim that assets, I think what they can do is to, take control of the operation of that infrastructure. So, for example, take control of the ports in Greece, Biarritz, or take control of the China-Euro railway system, something like that. But they cannot actually take it away. Just like the Nord Stream pipelines between Europe and Russia, actually, European Union didn't take away Nord Stream pipeline. They can only shut it down because that's actually been co-owned by both sides, right? So even financially or legally or realistically, it's impossible for they to take it away. It's not like a car. It's not like the cash, stored in a bank of Switzerland that you can just froze it and take it away. No, it's not something like that. It's called infrastructures with funding, with co-investment.
But they can deprive the right of operating it, right?
Operate what? Well, what's the value of China, for example? What's the value of that?
Like the railway?
What's the value of that railway? The railway is the railway. I think most of the function is that the European Union is the largest, importer to China. So which means European Union, needs more of the product, made in China and shipped to European Union. The daily groceries, the toys, T-shirt, semiconductors, EVs, everything. Well, most of the things actually goes from China to European Union to help every customer in Europe for the daily life, right? That's why China have a trade surplus against the European Union, and the European Union have an investment surplus against China. That's how it works. So when you take away that railway, guess what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that, European customers cannot get the product to ship it from China. China only need to stop sending the train to Europe, and that's it. And the result is going to be, catastrophic because the European Union, they're going to see inflation come again because everything is going to be very, very expensive because the product will be shipped from somewhere else by taking a detour, or it goes to the third-party shore and then reshored to European Union. So that's not good for European customers in the first place. Well, China will suffer from it as well, for sure. But China, have already been experiencing such kind of a situation. For example, America has already done the things to China. So China has, restructured the supply chain somewhere else. That's how it works. And trust me, America knows it. And for the real deal American businessman, they say one thing, but they understand another thing is that if they really want to block Chinese product, they're also killing themselves, killing their own benefit. So to a very large extent, they only say things and then do some example, but to a very large extent, they wouldn't kill it for good. They just want to, showcase some of their own stance and making an attitude towards the whole world about their situation and then let it go.
And Harvey, under such a scenario, what worst consequence can you picture for maybe both sides?
This is an unrealistic plan.
Yeah.
It's shooting one side's self in the foot. It's cutting off a nose despite the face. So for the U.S. and its allies, it's going to destroy the supply chains that exist in which huge amounts of bilateral trade are occurring. The same goes for EU and for its member states. Yeah, I mean, for China, it will cut off both imports, which will hurt the others, and exports, which will hurt the people who are trying to do this. It's completely unrealistic. It's not the same as seizing money out of a bank as has been done, like seizing Russian assets. That's a different kettle of fish. But here, like was just said, you're talking about infrastructure. The most you can do is cease their operation. You really can't melt them down. You can't monetize them. It's such a stupid proposal. And I just think it's America and its allies' way of saying that they're not happy about the war. But I don't think anything's going to be done until and unless there's absolute proof that China is materially and directly aiding the war effort. And I think China's been very clear that they're not doing that. If the U.S. has proof or NATO has proof, well, let them come forward with the proof. Right now, it's just a allegation without any substantiation whatsoever. It's built on a bunch of hot air. So until they can prove it, they can't even contemplate doing this crazy idea that they've proposed. I just basically think it's to stick a finger from NATO and the U.S. in China's eye, kind of like putting a red flag in front of a bull because they want to get a rise out of China in this resort. And it's stupid because we're all interconnected now economically. And this would wreck the global system, and it would not be advantageous for anybody. If I ever heard of a lose-lose plan that was worse than this, I haven't. This is the worst that I could think of. It's ill-conceived. It's never going to get off the ground. I don't usually bet, but I'm willing to bet money. This ain't going to happen.
I understand your stance. It's really a stupid plan, but I guess when, the Japanese army attacked Pearl Harbor, nobody, or even the United States itself, didn't expect that to happen, right? They would call it a stupid plan. But to Mike, the UK, it wouldn't be affected that much, right? If NATO actually implements such a plan.
Oh, I think it would. I think, as Harvey said, we're all interconnected. There's no hiding place, and the UK economy, as has been widely publicised, particularly since Brexit, it's heavily linked with trade with Europe, with mainland Europe, and people would argue the percentage, but certainly everyone would agree that it's 45 to 50% of our trade is with Europe, within the single European market. So any knock-on effect, any domino effect would immediately hurt the UK. And coming back to what the panelists have said, if a nation state does take such draconian action, if it actually does happen, and it's almost certainly not going to, it will have an immediately deleterious effect on their economy and therefore their political standing, on their economic activity, gross domestic product. It will create uncertainty in the market. It will have a negative impact on jobs, incomes, employment opportunities. But these infrastructure investments really are not just creating trade opportunities, they're leading to employment prospects, employment opportunities, and the growth of these. So I think the UK will most definitely be very, very concerned about the economic impact, as would other European nation states, where, let's face it, economic circumstances and prospects are perhaps there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but that's all there is. The UK economy, inflation seems to have stabilized. We're looking at a slightly better path ahead, but we really are still in the doldrums of the post-COVID economic era. So yes, I think the UK would be affected. And I think if this debate takes any further discussion, and I think there's the rumours that perhaps France have hinted this as well, it will go into the European Union, and it's the EU that will look at infrastructure and the implications of Chinese investment further, and not NATO. So I think it'll be taken out of NATO, the ball will be taken out of their court anyway. So yes, the UK will stand to lose economically, as will other individual nation states who will be very, very concerned about these US whisperers, most definitely.
How likely is it for the UK to veto that?
Highly likely. I think a number of European nations will quietly get round the table and make it very clear, probably try and keep it as private as possible, essentially to the Americans that this cannot go any further, and let's not risk public humiliation with some sort of veto and then a sort of almost a public collapse in any NATO unity. So I think they would almost certainly veto, and I suspect a number of European nations are probably preparing for that and are ready to take this further if these whispers, if this campaign gathers any momentum. I think they'll stamp on it very quickly.
And you all mentioned that Beijing has this capacity to retaliate, but the question is, will Beijing do it? China usually is quite restrained from, immediately attacking others, right? Even if it's faced with some containment. Dr. Chi?
So you mean Beijing will...
Yeah,
so
what would be Beijing's immediate action to that, if that happens?
If that happens, China, well, according to your previous experience, China will first start some negotiation or consultation, especially in the diplomatic way. And then we're probably going to file the case into multinational organizations, for example, like United Nations. China is still a very important member in the United Nations, especially the Security Council. So I can think that is a place we can have a thorough debate over the situation. And also, after rounds and rounds of diplomatic efforts been done, and I think China will issue its own retaliation. For example, China right now has blocked the many American CEOs entering into China and seized or froze their personal assets in China. And I think that makes a very strong announcement to the outside world. That is, China will also do the thing if its own lawful rights has been violated. And I think the current Western accusation to say China is an enabler is basically groundless and brutal stupidity. The reason why is that if you say that Chinese products has been seen or been assumed in helping them making certain weapons or infrastructures, indirectly or directly supporting the war, but basically just take a look. They also have many of the products, from America. You can still buy lots of products in Russia right now from America. You probably didn't ship it directly from the New York port, but they can actually buy it from India, for example. India has shipped lots of the product from United States and European Union to Russia. Why don't you call India an enabler? As well as India is an enabler of Iran, which is so-called, evil axle by NATO, especially by United States. But India purchased lots of Iran and Russian oil and shipped it to the European Union. So I think if you're saying who is actually enabling or financing those countries, well, I think every evidence will point to India. But I don't think, or I don't see any of these countries, neither America nor European Union or any NATO nations have said anything about India. I mean, what you're afraid of? Do you have anything in their, skeleton in the closet in the hand of Indian government? So I don't think this is a fair accusation. If you have the same standard, well, any country get involved indirectly or directly, you give them sanctions no matter what. Well, I would say you have a very tough standard, but now it's more like a very personal accusation. And China sells products to every nation of the world. Most of the product can be shipped to any countries through a third-party port, third-party market. So it's out of the country. For example, right now, I mean, in Afghanistan, Taliban are making lots of the trade to many other countries with US dollar. So are you saying that Federal Reserve is funding Taliban or funding not only the Afghanistan Taliban, but also ISIS, but also, Pakistan Taliban? US dollar and the euro, especially the big note euro, is the most favorable cash for the money laundering, for the money trafficking by those terrorist, organizations. So you're saying the ECB and the Federal Reserve is funding those organizations. And I do think those two organizations need to be sanctioned and, probably punished. So if you have the same standard, please do. We would like to see Mrs. Janet Yellen and also Ms. Lagarde to be punished and, have a hearing on them. So, but I assume this is basically impossible to do so because you have different standard, right? So, I mean, NATO is going to do their part and to do what they need to do, and China will do what they need to do.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Then, Harvey, is it, actually also stupid for the officials, whoever they were, to break this news to the media? They can cause some panic or turn out to be some alert to the Chinese side. And there may be some ensuing actions. People are saying China has already pulling out some investment from Europe. I'm wondering whether it's something that, the United States actually wants to drive some wedge between Europe and China. That's what, why it first came out.
Yes, of course, the U.S. wants to drive a wedge between China and Europe because they don't want Europe to exercise any strategic autonomy. Europe is kind of like America's lapdog, and they generally do what the U.S. says. There are more voices now that go contrary to that. There have been consistent voices, especially in the case of France and to some extent on other issues, Hungary, where the member states have gone in different directions. Frankly, I think this was done as a public relations initiative, and going to the media on it was their end point. They wanted to put this out as a proposal to stick it to China. I don't think they could have believed in their rightful mind, knowing how powerful China is, that China would take this sitting down, nor would they be willing to accept the loss of all these goods or the means to transport them in both directions. It is a stupid proposal, as we discussed before, and I'm not sure that it's realistic proposal. A lot of things get proposed that are not realistic or that have ulterior motives. The ulterior motive in this case was to try to get the world to see the American position, which is U.S. good, China bad, this kind of thing. And that doesn't stand anymore in our multipolar world, in our interdependent world. There's all this talk about decoupling, de-risking, and that kind of thing. But that's not going to go away. We live in an interdependent world, as it really should be. And this kind of proposal will never fly because it will destroy this world that's created. And it's not possible to go back to the 19th century or early 20th century model of tariffs and trade restrictions and things like that. The world's not going to be able to function like that. It didn't function like that well before, and it's not going to function like that in the future. This was a public relations exercise designed to stick it to China. And it's completely different than the situation you described before with Pearl Harbor, The Japanese went to Pearl Harbor because they were subject to embargo where they couldn't get oil and other strategic materials. So all they could do was confront the United States. These days, we have much more ways of resolving these problems if this comes to a push comes to shove situation. And they were mentioned by Dr. Chu. These are things like UN, like the World Trade Organization, and so on. I just think this was meant to be an irritant and nothing more by people who are frustrated.
Right.
The only way I could see the situation changing is if there's absolute proof that China is directly supplying material and assistance to Russia that's directly used in the war effort. China has denied that, and there's no proof, there's not one scintilla of proof that China is doing that. If that proof were ever to come out, okay, then we might have to talk about it again. But it's not going to happen.
Hopefully it won't happen. But if you're saying that this kind of proposals won't fly, but if they do fly and fly high, what kind of, in our wildest imagination, what kind of a scenario could happen? Like some people are saying it's kind of a declaration of war. Would that be that bad? The consequence?
I don't think, if I can just come in here,
Sure,
I don't think so at all. I think we just have to appreciate that the Belt and Road Initiative involves agreements with more than 140 countries, hundreds of billions of dollars. So if there was some sort of blockage in one or two European countries, there's plenty of opportunity for Beijing and China to redivert investment and continue investing in one or more or many of these 140 plus countries. So there really is opportunity for further investment elsewhere. World wars, not a chance.
Right, Harvey?
I honestly don't think this is going to happen. So it's a hypothetical situation.
Yeah.
It's different than the other situations. And as just was said a moment ago, this, through especially the Belt and Road Initiative, has resulted in so much two-way trade that we're not going to be able to blow up those tracks or impound them or stop the services from being held. This is not the 21st century way to go. So I think it's a lot of hot air and that nothing is going to come of it. And I don't even think China has to be concerned about it, quite frankly, because it's so unrealistic.
Right. Dr. Chu, maybe a financial war or a trade war or...
Well, we already had a trade war and tech war. So if that happened again, to some extent, I wouldn't be surprised at all. But still, I agree with Harvey and my other colleagues here. I think sometimes we don't need to take those politicians. They're not military, so they're not officers. So, I mean, who make the announcement, they're just pure politicians. Sometimes, Western politicians, they just say whatever they want to say, just for the show. It's a showmanship.
Right. They
say all kinds of things every day. If you take every word, for sure, and, to consider on that, you probably will, get crazy and, get depressed. But sometimes you just want to blow the steam and, let it out. So don't be serious about that. And I dig into that source of information. I found there only one serious, or maybe not serious, a media or agency make that, report. That is a CNN. But according to Mr. Trump, that is a fake news, right? So no other European Union serious news agency said something about that. There's probably some chit chat. It's an anger statement between, group discussion inside of during that summit. So don't take that serious. And I think the European Union are not stupid. NATO are not stupid. Right. And we're glad that, the people really make the serious call are not stupid in either of this country. So, well, they show their attitude. Yeah, we get it. But, well, I think it's not going to happen. And but we're going to face that kind of the zigzagging situation in international politics for quite a long time, sometime now.
Right. But this does serve as a reminder for China, right, that there is a possibility for China's overseas assets to be seized by foreign governments. So this question goes to all of you. What long-term strategies do you think, or do you suggest China should develop to safeguard its international investments from, similar risks in the future? Let's start with maybe Mike.
I think it's difficult, as I said earlier. I think nation states will always have the right somehow to seize appropriate assets, whether it's fixed assets, whether it's financial assets, under their sphere of political control. So I think what China needs to do is to continue with perhaps ramping up the promotion, the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative and the engagement and the economic prospects and the brighter economic future that is resulting for everybody as a result of China integrating more with the world economy. It's not a threat, it's an opportunity. So to continue to promote this, I don't think many people in the West are aware of the investment levels that China has made across Europe, large parts of Africa, large parts of Asia, into roads, rail, airports, bridges, and the benefits that have resulted already. So some sort of charm offensive promoting the benefits of what they're doing, I think, will lead to a much warmer, a better understanding of the benefits for everybody. I think that's what I would advocate.
Right. Dr. Chu?
Well, if you ask me about immediate solution, I'd probably say just to make a very clear headcount in the inventory of our assets and investment portfolio in any given region in the whole world to find out what's the situation and what's going on, and try to use the legal weapons to protect our assets through the diplomatic effort, through the legal effort, and etc. But that's not the root solution. That's not the fundamental solution towards our long-term issues. But if you ask how China can protect its global interest in the long term, well, I give you a very, very simple solution. Learn some English, all right? Especially with the younger generation of leaders or the government officials, when they can speak English as good as Indians, so they can talk to, their trading partners and investment partners in the West directly. Lots of misunderstanding will be avoided. And I think, during the Second World War, China and Europe and America, we used to fight, on the same side. And we have very good relation with each other. And during the opening up and the reform, China, Europe, and America also, developed on the same side. I think there's no reason we're going to confront each other. And we used to be very good partner. We used to be good friend. As long as we can, sometimes go through this sensitive period of time or the downward period of time of a whole economy globally, and I think we can work together with each other. But hey, the thing is, learn some English, or for them to learn some Chinese, talk to each other directly, I think is more effective than anything else,
Hopefully.
than we do in some other fronts.
Hopefully the solution is as simple as that. And the last but not least, Harvey, please.
Well, China's getting a much more powerful Navy. This is one thing, because if you have a strong presence, people will think twice about doing something extraordinarily illegal and extraordinarily bad. And the same thing goes to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. It's becoming stronger as well. So it's kind of a case of what we had in one of our early American flags, state flags that said, "Don't tread on me." So, don't go there, back off. And I think if this ever were to happen, it would be self-executing, in the sense that when people saw how global trade was being cut off and that they were not getting the things they needed for their industries to operate, or the goods that go to many families and homes and businesses, it would be a very short-term prospect. This is a crazy idea. It's not going to go anywhere.
Right. Hopefully it's a no-no, among NATO members. All right, on that note, we wrap up our chat for this session. Many thanks to Harvey Dzodin, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Dr. Chu Chang, Fellow of the Belt and Road Research Center, Minzu University of China, and Mike Baston, China Observer and a Senior Lecturer at the University of Southampton, in the UK, for sharing your insights. The show is available on all major podcast platforms. If you have any comments, please email radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yun. Thank you for listening. We'll have more chat at the Chat Lounge next week.